I met Eddie Ellis in the early 1980s. He was a former leader of the Black Panther Party in Harlem, New York. I met him at Green Haven Correctional Facility, where he was serving a 25-year prison sentence as a result of the FBI's COINTEL program, which targeted him, accused him falsely of killing a man he didn't even know, and giving him this incredibly long prison sentence. In 1990, the Quakers sponsored a conference at Green Haven Correctional Facility. I was fortunate to be in attendance. Eddie presented a most powerful and thought-provoking lecture that I think we can all benefit from today. He talks about the struggle for the non-traditional approach to criminal justice and social justice, and how we must be a part of that struggle. So I think we can all benefit, whether we are professionals, government officials, or social justice advocates, if we listen to what Eddie had to say, contemplate it, and use it as we engage in the struggle for social justice and reform in our criminal justice system.
Before I get started, I just want to make mention of last speaker, Claire Reagan, has been involved in criminal justice for the last 20 years, has been one of our most outstanding advocates. Albany in New York, prison legislation reform, good time, prisoners' rights, right to get married, publishes a newsletter, and has been on the forefront of every significant change in New York State prisons since Attica in 1971. Give a round of applause for her. Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to try this afternoon. The reason why we're turning this way, face this way, is because I'm going to use the blackboard, and we had originally intended to do some workshopping here this afternoon. And I'm going to try to take what I've been hearing here and what some of the prisoners have been saying, some of the comments from our outside people, and I'm going to try to tie it all together in a coherent whole so that we have some basic idea of what we're doing and where we're going and how we got to where we are, and some of our thoughts and some of the things that we've been planning and thinking and doing here at Green Haven and numerous other prisons. The brother from the Baptist church said he wanted to know what we can do, what are the solutions, where can we go? So we want to talk about that a little bit this afternoon, and we want to try to give you some understanding, especially the community people from rural upstate areas, non-white, non-black, non-Latino people. I want to try to give you some understanding of where we're coming from as prisoners, as inner city people, African Americans, Latinos. We want to try to convey to you a sense of who we are and how we got here and where we hope to go from here. We've developed over the last 10, 12 years or so, excuse me, what we call a non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice. And the non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice here is an examination on the part of prisoners into their own condition, into some of the reasons and some of the causes for their condition. And this examination began with a self-inquiry. Most people in prison have one thing on mind, and that is getting out, going home, returning to the community from which they came. Many of us, most of us, come from inner city communities in New York City. And when we look at our communities, when we look at the places to which we must return, we begin to realize that these communities have become so devastated with crime and drugs and violence and miseducation and a number of other things that leaves precious little for us to return to. We understand very clearly, most of us, that our futures are tied up with those communities. And that if we don't begin to do something now, while we're here in prison about that, we won't have anywhere to go when we leave here. We certainly can't leave outside those communities. The examples have been horrendous for people of color who have attempted to move outside of traditionally accepted areas where people of color live. The violence and the level of destruction is at an all-time high. So as there's been, in addition, there has been, as a result of the overwhelming number of people coming into prison in the last 5 years, there has been a tremendous upsurge in consciousness and in commitment of prisoners who begin to realize that their destiny, their lives are intimately linked to the communities from which they came. And in an attempt to make some sense out of where we are and how we got here, we began to develop these non-traditional approaches to criminal and social justice. The non-traditional approach challenges, it begins by challenging all of the basic assumptions that the criminal justice and the social justice system in this country are underlying, that's the foundation of it. We begin to ask some hard, serious questions about justice in America, about life in America, about the American economy, about poverty, about race, about all of the things that impact on our lives that have eventually led to us coming to prison. We begin to question some of the basic foundations of the structure of this society. And I think that this is what is absolutely necessary. Concurrently with what we've been doing, the American Friends Service Committee has been developing their own questions and their own models and their own approach to criminal and social justice. And in their development of their model, they put together the 200 years of the penitentiary system, Time for Change. A couple of years ago, we got a hold of a copy and we read it, and we were amazed at the fact that the ideas and the concepts that they were putting together were very similar to what we were doing. We also got a chance to take a look at the restorative justice concept that the Friends were putting together. And ironically enough, the restorative justice concept, the Time for Change 200th anniversary package, and the non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice that we are developing all fit together like a glove. And we said we have a marriage here. We have an understanding here, not just among ourselves. It was a reaffirmation of the fact that obviously we're moving in the right direction. Other people are talking about the same things. But the most important thing that struck us in the Friends, in the American Society, American Friends Society package, the thing that struck us the most was the repeated call for the inclusion of communities of color in the decision-making process in criminal and social justice. That was the most singular, outstanding thing that struck us. Thank you.
Amen.
We got a non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice. I want to, in the time that I have allotted, I want to try to break it down, and I want to try to give you some sense of where we're coming from and how we developed it. We've got traditional ways. We've got a traditional system here. We've got a... We got a traditional system here that looks something like this. And we say it's traditional because it reflects the traditional values of America. It reflects a middle-class ethic, middle-class value system. It's rooted in rules and regulations that govern, that's good for everybody. It's very general. It's middle class. For the most part, it's white. And the underlying premises, the underlying assumptions of this model are very what we call Eurocentric. That is to say that its base comes from the European model, European classics, traces its development back to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and the Greeks, develops its literature and its understandings from a Eurocentric perspective. So these are the key characteristics of a traditional model. We see the model in the classroom, we see the model in the churches, we see the model in in all of the institutions that govern this country. And the model was a valid model, and probably still is a valid model to a large degree, when these institutions were institutions that service predominantly white people. That is to say, up until about 1960, the overwhelming majority of people in this country, especially in New York State and New York City, were white people. And this model, this general middle-class white Eurocentric model, was a valid model at that time because it serviced white people. About late 1950s, early 1960s, we began to see a rise in the number of African Americans and Latinos in this country. Late 1950s, we've seen a mass migration of Puerto Ricans coming to the United States. We saw a tremendous increase in the birth rate, African Americans, and we began to get institutions that were populated more and more by non-white people. And as these institutions began to be populated more and more by non-white people, this model began to have some very serious problems, serious ramifications. You got to ask yourself, for instance, in New York City, why is it that blacks and Latinos have a dropout rate of 75% adult males? 75%, 3/4 of them drop out of school before the 10th grade. Why is that? You have to ask yourself, why is it in the inner city communities where blacks and Latinos live, the unemployment rate among young males between the ages of 18 and 30 are higher now, today in 1990, than the unemployment rate was at the height of the Great Depression in 1933. Why is that? One of the reasons we feel for that is the imposition of this traditional structure, this traditional value system on inner city people. So we felt that if this perhaps was a problem, one of the things that we needed to do was we needed to develop an alternative approach, a non-traditional approach. And our non-traditional approach looks something like that. It's no longer general. It doesn't fit everybody. It's what we call community specific. It's not a middle class model because most of the people in the inner city are not middle class people. Most of them are working class people. And what is new termed the underclass. It's not a white model because most of the people in the inner city are not white people. Most of the people in the inner city are blacks and browns. So it's black and it's brown. It speaks the interests of blacks and browns. But most important, it begins to redefine the Eurocentric approach in a more what we call Afro-Latino centric. That is to say, this non-traditional model is looked at through the eyes of Latino men. Is looked at through the eyes of African men. And when we see things, we see it different than what you see. It doesn't mean that our way is right and your way is wrong. It just means that our experience is different than your experience. It means that our background is different than yours. Our values may be a little different than yours. Certainly our culture, our food, our language, our dress, a little different than yours. Put no value on it at all. Yours is not better than mine, and mine certainly isn't better than yours. Mine is just a little different than yours. However, all of my life as an African man in America, I have been taught that this is the way that I should be. And that somehow or other, if I don't fit into this model, if I don't fit into a middle-class white Eurocentric model, then there's something wrong with me. That I need to change my ways, that I need to somehow or other readapt myself so that I can fit into this model and be successful in America. The only way that you can be successful in America is that you have to fit into this model, okay? And this model is like a square hole, and I'm like a round guy. And if I fit into that square hole, then a serious change is going to have to take place in me. In order to fit me into that square hole, you can fit me in there, but you got to force me in there. And when you force me into that square hole, what happens is you begin to damage me because I don't fit in there naturally. And in the process, you might even damage yourself. Okay? So what we have to do is we have to develop a model that fits a round guy, not a square guy. And we decided that this model would be what we would begin to work with in the prisons and in the community. We start by saying that there are no prison problems. Duke said it earlier. There are no prison problems that don't exist also in the community. All we have is community problems. If we're able to solve those community problems, we'll be able to solve the prison problems. The non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice begins with a historical perspective. And this historical perspective covers a period of time from 1940 to 1990. And what happened in 1940 to 1990? Why is that important? The reason that's important is because, excuse me 1 minute. My mouth is very dry. Talk too much, I guess. The reason that's important is because in 1940, if you take a look at the prison system, you will not see black people in it. There were no black people in the prison system in 1940 in any appreciable numbers that we would stand out. It was an almost all-white system. If you take a look at the prison system in 1990, 50 years later, it's almost an all-black system. There's almost very few whites in here. We got a whole room of prisoners. There's not one white guy in here with a green pants on. Why is that? What happened? Oh, excuse me. You got one. He's token.
He's the exception.
He's the exception. You're exceptions. Token white guy. Alan, his name is. He's with the Greenhaven Monthly. He's a photographer. What happened between 1940 and 1990 that accounted for black people coming into these prisons in unprecedented numbers? What happened? So we had to look at this. We had to develop a historical perspective. And we broke it down into 10-year periods. From 1940 to 1950, from 1950 to 1960 to 70 to 80, and then to finally 90, in 10-year periods. 50 to 60, 60 to 70, 70 to 80, all the way down 10-year periods. And what we found out was that as the social and political and economic conditions changed and worsened in the black and Latino community, more and more blacks and Latinos began to come to prison. 1940, 1945, when the soldiers returned from World War II, very few blacks was in prison. And as those returning soldiers began to occupy jobs, began to take advantage of GI Bill, etc., we begin to see discrimination in the northern cities, and particularly in New York State, that began to freeze black people out of jobs. And we continue to see that up until today. And as the unemployment rate of black people began to rise, so did the rate at which they came into the prisons. There are a number of other factors that are involved in the historical perspective. The most important are the fact that the institutions, the basic institutions that control the life, the well-being, and the destiny of black and Latino people in the inner cities began to deteriorate somewhere around the late 50s. The church, the family, healthcare, education, all of these institutions that were designed to maintain and uphold and provide a powerful and positive quality of life for people in these communities began to deteriorate. One of the reasons that they began to deteriorate, we believe, based on our analysis, is that these institutions began to become overwhelmingly black, and the administrators, the policies, and the general value system that undergird these institutions remain traditional, remain general, remain middle class, remain white, remain Eurocentric. Perhaps the greatest example of that is not the prisons, but the school system. I'm 48 years old. I went to school. I was born and raised in New York City. I went to school in New York City. When I went to school, black people were in the minority in my class and in my school. And at that time, in the late 50s, New York City had the finest school system in the country. The finest school system in the United States, public education, best there was. 25 years later, New York City has the worst public school system in the country. And during that 25-year period, we saw the same thing that we see here in the prisons. White flight to the suburbs, blacks begin to increase in the inner cities, blacks and Latinos begin to become the predominant students in the system. The administrators of the system are all white, the principals are all white, the teachers are all white, the curriculum is all white, the books are all white, the values are all white, and everything that was taught in those schools came from this model, the general model. It's like one size fits everybody. And if you don't fit into that one size, something's wrong with you. And what happened was the kids began to rebel against that. Little black kids and little brown kids, little Latino kids began to say, I don't see myself anywhere in this model. I don't see my history reflected anywhere in this model. I don't see anything about me that I can relate to Dick and Jane and the little dog named Spot. Because we don't have a little dog named Spot, and Dick and Jane is a myth for most of us. So these kids began to rebel in their own little conscious ways against this. And that rebellion manifested itself 20 years later in the fact that 75% of the adult males in the schools in New York City drop out before the 10th grade. 75%. And where do they wind up? Right here. Right here in this joint. They wind up right here in Green Haven. Because the traditional sense of values that was superimposed on an alien culture was not assimilatable. We could not assimilate into that kind of a thing. Took 20 years, 1989, July of last year, you heard me mention of the Sobel report. Thomas Sobel, the Commissioner of Education, commissioned a group of academic researchers and scholars and professors to study the question in New York City to determine what is the problem. Why are these kids dropping out? Why are we having so much of a hassle out of these kids? All of the violence in the schools, all of the things that we see. And that commission came back, they did what they call a curriculum of inclusion. And that curriculum, if you want to read something in addition to the book that Claire Reagan just mentioned, get the Sobel report, the curriculum of inclusion. Because in that report, it outlined very clearly and very succinctly the philosophical and ideological underpinnings for the necessity of developing non-traditional models for school children. Are you with me so far? Amen. Does it make sense? Amen. All right. Let's take one look at the contemporary realities. $55,000 men in prison, New York State. Before the end of the year, it's going to be close to 60,000. 55,000 men, New York State Prison. When Claire Reagan started operations in 1971 or thereabouts, we had a population of 12,000 men. From 1971 until 1990, about 19 years, almost 20 years, we went from 12,000 men to 55,000 men. They're coming into prison at the rate of 20,000 a year. That's the number of guys come upstate every year, 20,000. 55,000 is the present population. This is going to be startling. 85%, 49% of that 55,000 are black men. 36% of that 55,000 are Hispanic men.
And rising.
And rising, faster than we want to think about. 85% of the total men in New York State prison population are blacks or Hispanics. 85%. Now that is phenomenal in light of the fact that blacks and Hispanics together don't make up more than 25% of the total population in New York State. Less than 25% of the total population in New York State account for 85% of all the men in prison. Something wrong. Something is radically wrong. What's even more startling, we found out in our research, was that of the 85% of the total population, 55,000, imagine this, 75% of the 55,000 come from New York City. Huh? 75% of everybody in New York State prisons come from New York City. Where do they come from? Where do they get all of these guys? They don't come from all over New York City. Very few people here live on Park Avenue. Very few people here in these prisons live on the Upper West Side. Very few people in these prisons from Madison Avenue and Wall Street. These 75% come from 18 specific assembly districts. That's how we narrowed it down. You know what an assembly district is, right? Everybody know what assembly district is? New York State's political division. This whole state is divided up into assembly districts for representation. In Albany, the New York State Assembly, there are 150 assembly districts in the state of New York. 150 assembly districts in the state of New York. 18 of them account for 75% of all the people in these prisons. Something's going on in these 18 assembly districts that's not going on in the other 132 assembly districts. Something is taking place in those 18 assembly districts that's not happening nowhere else that accounts for 75% of all the men in New York State prisons coming out of those districts. Now what is it that's taking place in those districts? What is it that they have in those 18 assembly districts that obviously don't appear in the other 132? And if they do appear in the other 132, they appear in lesser degree so that fewer men from the other 132 come to prison. What's going on in those 18? First of all, where are those 18 assembly districts? You know where they are? Where would you say?
South Bronx.
South Bronx, no question. South Bronx, East Harlem, Harlem, Central Harlem. Where else?
East New York.
Central Harlem,
Bed-Stuy.
East New York, Bedford-Stuyvesant,
Brownsville.
Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville,
Jamaica.
South Jamaica,
Queens.
primarily, and a couple other places.
Lower East Side.
Lower East Side. Lower East Side, South Bronx, East Harlem, Central Harlem, East New York, which is in Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville, South Jamaica. Every one of these areas right here fit right into these 18 assembly districts. Every single one of them. And those are the areas that contribute 75% of all of the people in New York State prisons.
So who lives in them areas, Eddie?
Now who lives in those areas? Who you think lives in those areas? Who you see in all these prisons? George Bush don't live there, I'll tell you that. Neither does Ronnie. You know who lives in those areas? Blacks and browns. African Americans and Latinos. Poor whites, some poor whites too. About 8% poor whites and 2% others. Others are the Asians and some other groups. 75% of all the people in New York City, in New York State prisons, come from these areas right here. So now we have to ask the question, what's going on in these areas that account for all of these people coming to prison? What are the common denominators? What are the factors that link these things together? Duke made mention of it, 2 or 3 other guys made mention of it. It's a thing that we call, we got room here somewhere. I'll put it over here. We call them crime generative factors. And the crime generative factors are those factors that seem to have or seem to be the indicators of who comes to prison. If these factors impact on your life, then the chances of you coming to prison are so astronomically high you can bet money on it. The sociologists say that if you are black or brown and you live in one of these 18 assembly districts, the chances are 3 out of 5 adult males are coming to prison, 60%, 3 out of 5 adult males. You can bet on that. How do we know that you can bet on that? The reason that we know that you can bet on that is because when the New York State Department of Corrections says by the year 2000 we're going to need X number of cells, that's a projection that they're making. How do you think they're making that projection? They're making that projection based on what's taking place in these areas. They're making that projection based on what they know to be the crime generative factors. They know about the crime generative factors. We're just learning about them. What are those crime generative factors? The number one factor. The number one factor, even more pervasive and more important and more than anything else, is racism. Now that might be difficult for a lot of people to swallow, but that's a fact of life. As far back as the late 60s, Thomas Kerner did a report, the Kerner report. And in that report he said, and this is 68, 67 maybe, the Kerner report said America was a racist society, that we had 2 separate and unequal societies, a black one and a white one, and that your life chances, your chances for success, if you were born into the white one, were infinitely greater than if you were born into the black one. So racism is the number one factor that takes place in these communities that accounts for 75% of all the people in the prison system coming out of 18 assembly districts. In addition to racism, we see several other things. My time is getting a little short here, so I'm going to have to run through this rather quickly. But I want to just make a couple of really key points here. And bear with me if I run over a little bit, because I think it's important that the people understand where we're coming from and how we developed this model. And I hope I'm not stepping on Larry's toes, because he's going to be the next guy and I don't want to cut him too short. But after racism, we think the next most important thing is the whole question of the family. And once that family structure begins to break down, we are finished gambling. After the family structure, we think the next most important thing is education. Okay, so that's 1, 2, and 3, education. After education, we think the next most important thing is employment. And what we see in these communities is a pattern of racism that impacts negatively on the family structure. The family structure breaks down. In most cases, if you take a profile of all the men in prison, you will find some common denominators. Most of them come from single-parent families. Most of their people earn less than $12,000 a year. Most of them were high school dropouts. Most of them were unemployed at the time that they got busted. Most of them were drug or alcohol abusers. Okay, so racism accounts for a breakdown in the family structure. As that family structure begins to break down, we see a corresponding lack of education, either uneducation, undereducation, or miseducation. One of the 3. It doesn't make any difference which one of the 3 it is, or a combination of all 3, the result is still the same. The product of miseducation or uneducation or undereducation is a person who is not capable or qualified or have the skills to be gainfully employed. If you're not gainfully employed, that means you have no source of income to sustain yourself and your family. If you have no source of income to sustain yourself and your family, you have to resort to one of 3 things. Most of the inner city people, and particularly the females, resort to the welfare system. They go on welfare. Most of the men are too proud to do that, too arrogant to do that, too tough to do that. So they do something else. There's another group of people who just fall out altogether. They just give up. A phenomenon that has increased since 1979, 1980 is the phenomenon of homeless people. They just drop out. They just give up. They stop gambling. They say it's all over. And the phenomena is that these homeless people are getting younger and younger and younger. We used to make a joke about the old shopping bag lady. She's 60, 70 years old, 80 years old. People dispossessed her. She didn't have nowhere to go. She was sleeping on the subway in New York City. Well, now that old shopping bag lady is a 22-year-old black or Latino male with nowhere to go, and he's sleeping in a shelter in an armory that used to be for the National Guard. Homelessness, and the last category is hustle. If you don't drop out and you don't go on welfare, you begin to hustle. Hustle is a way of earning income other than legitimate employment. Hustle usually is kind of soft. It's not a hard kind of thing. You know, you might take a little numbers, or you might run a little after-hour joint, sell a little illegal booze. You might even peddle a little marijuana or something like that. To just make ends meet, keep yourself up over water. But sooner or later, you begin to realize that this hustle ain't going to get it. That there are other ways of making money that's harder and faster, but the money is a whole lot bigger. And then you get involved in the hard stuff. That's the direct crime and the sale and use of drugs. And once you do that, once you get involved in crime and drugs, which is what this hustle business leads to, once you get involved in crime and drugs, you have two alternatives. One of them is that you're coming to prison. The other one is that you're going to the graveyard. Prison or death. There are no other alternatives. So we say that the crime-generative factors, racism, the breakdown of the family, miseducation, unemployment, welfare, homelessness, hustling, leads to crime, leads to drugs, and crime and drugs leads to prison and leads to death. That's the bottom line. That's the ball game. That's how we got here. That's what we're doing here. And this is not to say that we absolve ourselves in totality of the responsibility for committing the crimes that we committed here. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that my options in life were so severely limited, my choices were so circumspect that I had no real decision over what I was going to do. Because if I did have a decision about what I was going to do, I wouldn't be here. The natural consequence of that, or the natural question that you would ask is, well, if that's true, why is it that some people in the inner city communities don't come to prison? A whole lot of them don't come to prison. A whole lot of them still out there. And the reason for that, we believe, is that one or more of these crime-generative factors was either absent in their situation or did not impact on them as severely as it did the guys coming to prison. That is to say that in a family that was headed by a single parent who was a female, somehow or other that single parent was able, through whatever reasons, to instill in her children the fact that they must get education. She forced them to get the education. She didn't tolerate any foolishness. She made them go to school. She stayed on top of their case in such a way that at very least they were able to graduate from high school and begin to become some kind of gainfully employed. Or some other of the crime-generative factors somewhere along the line allowed for a person to slip through this net, allowed for a person to be caught before they fell all the way to the bottom. In our communities, there are a number of institutions that are set up to catch a person before they get all the way down to the prison and the death central. What has happened is those institutions have broken down. And as those institutions have broken down, we find more and more men coming to prison. Very briefly, let me wind this up by saying a couple of things right off the top of the bat. As a result of this historical perspective, we develop what we call a direct relationship. A direct relationship says that there is a corresponding relationship between the community and the prison. And that relationship is governed by the fact, A, that we have so many people from the community in the prisons, and that all of the people in the community who are in the prisons suffer from one or more of the crime-generative factors. The situation has gotten so enormous at the time that right now 20,000 a year are coming into the prisons, and between 14 and 17,000 a year are leaving out of the prisons and going back into the community. This we call a direct relationship. And this direct relationship says simply that given these numbers, 20,000 a year coming into the prison and 14 to 17,000 a year leaving the prison and going back into the community, this community must have a direct stake and a direct voice and some direct input into what happens in the prison system. This direct relationship says that somehow or other we have to ensure that this 17,000 a year going back into the community goes back into the community in some viable way better than when they came into the prisons. Because if they don't, what we're talking about here, if we say that this rate of recidivism is 47%, which is almost 50%, that means half of these 17,000 guys going back to the black and Latino community are going to commit another crime. That's 8,500 new crimes a year given these statistics. We can't stand it. You can't stand it. So what needs to happen, we think, is that the community must begin to get involved in the prison in some very meaningful way. To just wind it up very briefly, in the package of literature that you were given, there's a one-page summary of this entire presentation. The final wind-up is simply this. As a result of all of these figures, as a result of all of these things, we've developed a non-traditional approach. The non-traditional approach is three things. It's community-specific, because the communities that are most affected need to be specifically addressed. That is to say, the programs, the policies, the things that take place in the prison and in the community must be addressed. And we started out by saying that there are no prison problems. There are only community problems. So whatever problems we face here in the prison, we have to give equal and corresponding weight to in the community. Any approach to prison program, any approach to change, any approach to altering the situation as we see it now, in terms of the non-traditional approach, in terms of the restorative justice, in terms of the 200-year anniversary package, has got to be community-specific. Additionally, it has got to be Afro and Latino-centric. That is to say, it must come from a perspective that reflects the culture and the values and the history of Africans and Latinos, because we are the overwhelming majority of people in the prisons. And finally, whatever we do must have some element of community empowerment. That is to say that our efforts must be developed and must be encouraged towards the gaining and maintaining of political, social, and economic power, so that the communities most affected can begin to create the structures and the wherewithal necessary to deal with these crime-generative factors, so that we can slow up the influx of 20,000 men a year coming into the prisons. We have a dual mission. The non-traditional approach has a dual mission. Part of the mission is to slow up the flow of 20,000 a year coming into the prisons, and the other part of the mission is to send 17,000 men a year out of the prisons in such a way as to allow them to return to the community with some sense of empowerment. We say that rehabilitation has been a massive failure. The reason rehabilitation has been a massive failure is because of all of these things right here. Because the rehabilitation model in these prisons are based on a general model. One size fits all. It's middle class, it's white, it's Eurocentric, and it doesn't fit where we're coming from. The rehabilitation model is a model that says we will take an individual and give him a skill or trade that allows him to return to society and fit in where he couldn't previously fit in before. The basic assumption of the rehabilitation model, of course, is that you did fit in somewhere before, and somehow or other, somewhere along the line, you erred, you went wrong. You need to be, that you were habilitated, and somehow or other you erred and you went wrong, and now you need to be rehabilitated. That model presupposes, the basic assumption of that model is that the society allows you to fit into it. So you come to prison and you get a skill or you get a trade, and you leave here and return back to the community to be able to fit back into it. That model was valid up as long as these prisons were predominantly white people. because white people could get a skill or a trade and then return to the general society and fit in because they had middle-class values and because everything that they did was associated with a Eurocentric perspective. So it wasn't no problem. What are the main industries in prison? Construction, plumbing, electricians, masonry, carpentry. These are the main things that they teach you here in the joint. Am I right? Every single one of those things, plumbing, electrician, carpentry, masonry, construction, every single one of those things, if you go back to New York City, you have to get involved with a craft or trade union. Those trade unions are predominantly father-son unions. And the fathers and the sons don't look like me. At the very least, they have a quota for apprentices. So no matter what kind of skill or what kind of trade I get while I'm here in prison, when I leave prison and go to the street, I can't apply that skill. I can't apply that trade. And the reason for that is because I don't have access to the general society. I only have access to my community, and that community is fraught with these crime-generative factors. So we must begin to address the crime-generative factors as well as programs in the prisons. Finally, we say that in addressing the crime-generative factors, we have to do three things, and then I'm going to wind it up and get right on out of here. The three things that we're going to have to do is we have to address, first, crime-generative, Duke talked about it, crime-generative attitudes. What are the crime-generative attitudes? The crime-generative attitudes, very briefly, are this. If you were born and raised in one of these 18 assembly districts, from the time you were a kid until the time you were born until the time you were 17, 18 years old, you develop a value system. You develop a way of looking at the world. You develop a set of rules and regulations and guidelines that govern your life. And those rules and regulations and guidelines are not general middle-class white or Eurocentric. They come out of a particular culture of poverty and deprivation. They come out of a culture that's permeated by the fact that you are a second-class citizen, that you are discriminated against, that your access to the general society is very limited. When you superimpose that on these crime-generative factors, single-family parent, lack of education, unemployment, etc., when you superimpose that, you develop a person, you develop a kid who's got an attitude that says, I'm going to get mine, and I don't care nothing about you, and if I got to hurt you or harm you or kill you or rob you or rape you to get mine, that's what I'm going to do. And I don't give a fuck about you. That's the kind of language they use. That language and that attitude and that behavior pattern comes out of this hopelessness, comes out of the crime-generative factors, and comes out of the fact that from their eyes, from their perception, they see a world that is stacked against them and it's them against the world. And until we begin to address those crime-generative attitudes here in the prison, we're going to always return men to the society who feel the same way. Doesn't make any difference that I come in here and I got an associate's degree, or I get a bachelor's degree, or I get a master's degree. Doesn't make any difference unless the crime-generative attitudes are addressed. Because what happens is, you take a kid that came in here, he killed somebody, he was a dope dealer, he was a pimp, or whatever he was. He comes into prison, he's got 10 years to do, he does the 10 years as a model guy. He goes to school, he gets an education, he gets a bachelor's degree, some of them even get a master's degree, and when he leaves here, what does he leave here? He leaves here an educated dope dealer. He's here an educated pimp. He leaves here an educated stick-up kid who now has the wherewithal, the discipline, the management skills, and the ability to be a better criminal than he was when he came here in the first place. And the reason for that, thank you. The reason for that is because the crime-generative attitudes that he developed over the course of his life have never been addressed here in the prison. No prison in New York State that I know of has ever seriously addressed the question of crime-generative attitudes. One other thing goes with that, and that is the whole question of the law. How do we look at the law? Crime-generative attitudes tell me as a black man that this law was never intended for me, law was never made for me, I didn't make it, don't have nothing to do with it, don't care nothing about it, I'm not going to respect it, and every time I feel like breaking it, that's what I'm going to do, because it's not my law. You hear these kids talking, what do they say? That's the white man's law. We don't have to respect that. White man don't respect us, so why should we respect him? And that attitude has to be addressed here in the prison, and if we don't address it, then we're fooling ourselves. Two other things. In addition to addressing the crime-generative attitudes, we have to address the ethnic status. Ethnic status meaning the fact that I have to come to terms, these young kids in here have to come to terms with the fact that they're blacks and Hispanics, and they have to understand clearly what being black and Hispanic means. It means historically and traditionally and legally for a long, long time. I mean, hands up, ever read Dred Scott? United States Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott, came out in the late 1800s, said that no black man in America had any rights that white people were bound to respect. United States Supreme Court said that. And the fact of the matter is that Dred Scott has never been seriously overturned. There's never been a case that come down to repeal Dred Scott. And if not in law, then in fact, the attitudes that allowed Dred Scott to be a United States Supreme Court decision are very much prevalent in the country today. We're seeing it more and more and more. So I understand that. It don't take me long to understand that. I started understanding that somewhere around the 6th or 7th grade. By the time I get to the 10th grade, that's one of the reasons why I drop out of school. And all my life I've been told that I'm not nothing. You ain't nothing. You're a nigger. You're a stick. You don't deserve nothing. You need to clean your act up. You need to get over here and be more general and more middle class and more white and more Eurocentric. And if you can't do that, then we don't even want to talk to you. I've been led to believe that black people and Hispanic people have never made any serious contribution to the world or to themselves. I've been led to believe that I am worthless. And as long as I feel that I am worthless, then it don't make no difference whether I live or die. You hear these kids say, today, I'm living for the day, and if I die tomorrow, I had a lot of fun. And that kind of a person is a dangerous person. That kind of a person will kill you, will rob you, will rape you without the slightest degree of remorse. So we must, in here in the prisons, address the ethnic status. We must begin to teach these kids that they have a history, that they have a culture that they can be proud of, that blacks and Latinos built this world, that the African civilization is a glorious civilization, that we trace our history back to the beginning of time. We've got to do what the Sobel report says, make an inclusion of African and Latino and Asian and Native American history into the curriculum so that we develop a spirit and an understanding in these kids that make them realize that they are worth somebody, that they are somebody, and that they can be somebody, and that they don't have to fit into this Eurocentric model. Once they begin to understand that, once they begin to understand that they have an identity as African men, as Latino men, as Hispanic people, once they begin to understand that they have a culture and a history and a tradition that is just as rich as the European history and tradition, then they will begin to develop what we call the third thing, and that is a sense of themselves and of community. And that sense of community then begins to be the foundation upon which we build here in these joints. We have to develop a sense of community. We develop that sense of community by understanding our ethnic status, by understanding our common history, our common background, our common culture, our common customs, our common traditions. And once we begin to understand that those traditions and that culture is rich and varied, once we begin to take pride in who we are as black and Latino men, then we will begin to turn these joints around, and then we will begin to have some sense of community. And that sense of community will extend from the prison out to those places that we came. That sense of community will develop in us the understanding that one of the things that we need to do when we leave here is we must combat these things over here. We will begin to understand that we cannot survive, that our survival is intimately linked to destroying the crime-generative factors. First we destroy them within ourselves, and then we destroy them in the community. And until we destroy these crime-generative factors on the individual level and on the community level, we just spinning our wheels, we just playing games. So in a nutshell, that sums up the non-traditional approach. There's some other aspects of it, but my time is running out, and I can't really get into all of that at this point. I just want to make mention of one other thing, and that is that we have already developed some models. We have several classes in here in different stages of development that deal with this crime-generative factors, the crime-generative attitudes, the ethnic status, the sense of community, etc. One of them, Cuso mentioned, was the Consensia group, which is a Latino group. The other one is a group called the Resurrection Study Group. We have several others in the Organization of Caribbean African Unity, CAU. We have the Hispanics United for Progress is developing their own model. The Muslims have developed a model called the Islamic Therapeutic Program. The African American, the Black Studies class in the school over here is developing a model. We have about 6 or 7 models that we're in the process of developing. But we need some help. We need some help because those 7 models are the only ones that are addressing these 3 things. And anything that happens in these prisons that doesn't address these 3 things, we're talking about spending a lot of money and wasting a lot of time. One final thing, and that is that these 3 things that we address here in the prison must also be addressed in the community. We can't operate in a vacuum. What we do here is intimately linked to what happens in the community. We started out by saying there are no prison problems. We only have problems in the community. And when we begin to address the problems in the community, dealing with those 3 areas, primarily in the school, in the churches, and hopefully in some of the families, then we'll begin to slow up the number of people coming into these prisons. And if they have to come, we'll be able to give them something so that when they leave these prisons, they'll be able to return to society as a law-abiding citizen who has empowered himself or herself to the degree that they understand the reality that they'll be confronted with and are willing to deal